Tonight, making sense of a violent, sometimes chaotic world where change is the one constant. Here's our panel on the big problems and the possible solutions. Let's welcome Chair of Social Work and Policy Studies at the University of Sydney, Jioji Ravulo. Ukraine Democracy Initiative co-founder and University of Technology Sydney academic Olga Oleinikova. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, writer and social analyst Rebecca Huntley, and historian, academic and writer Peter Frankopan. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Patricia Carvelis. I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we're bringing you Q&A tonight. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quandra is the hashtag. Please get involved. To get us started tonight, here's a question from Shadiel Fader.
We speak of and worry about World War III, but has a cold World War III already begun?
Big question. Olga.
Okay, so I'm going first. Yeah, that's a very big one. We've been talking about the Third World War, I think, for the last 2 years, at least in Europe. You know, definitely there's a lot of conflicts, war conflicts happening globally. And I checked actually some statistics for this, chat, and it looks like last year in December, we were at the biggest number of wars happening globally, right? I think it's between 45 to 55 war conflicts happening globally at this moment. So you can judge for yourself, right? So definitely we are now in a very hot point. Definitely we see that the level of the Cold War, which is actually happening, can quickly transform into a hot withstanding between the key leaders in the regions. So it's a very hard question to say, will it happen when it happened? But, judging by the dynamics, it looks like we are really at a very turning point in time at the moment.
Peter, are we, in historical terms?
I think when we use the word World War, we tend to think back, of course, to the two great wars of the 20th century and how that engulfed the flames of Europe, brought in every corner of the world. And I suspect that what we're looking at today is slightly different. It's localised fractures. Like Olga says, we have more wars happening at the end of last year than at any point in the last 30. Defence budgets around the world are all going to go up in the coming years. And, the law of math tells you that the more investment you make in your defence forces, the more likely there are to be problems. So the real big challenge, I think, is about the nuclear proliferation, high levels of big weaponry that can be used either through bad planning and through malevolence, or through the kinds of fractures where contacts between fighter jets between different countries can have chain reactions that can engulf us all. So there are lots of small fires burning. I'd probably think that
don't they all sort of come together and
well,
then
I
there's a
suspect
giant
that those
bushfire?
small ones will get bigger. I don't see at the moment a war that brings us all in. In fact, most countries in the world are highly neutral on Russia and Ukraine for bad, but have choosing to abstain, not getting involved, helping to move weapons, helping to move materials into Russia through different third-party states. So most people are trying to stay out of it and stay out of the way. So World War looks very different to the world where Australians, Indians and others gave their lives to fight wars that meant something in Europe. So I suspect we're looking at something that can engulf us, but not on that kind of scale.
Malcolm Turnbull?
Look, I think I agree with both friends here. I think there's a lot of hot wars going on. We don't, thank heavens, have a world war at this stage. You mentioned a Cold War. Is the tension between the United States and China reminiscent of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union? There are some similarities, but more differences, to be honest. I mean, the Soviet Union and the United States and its allies had very little economic integration. China is the largest trading partner of most countries in the world, and certainly of the United States and Australia and most of the countries in this region. So the degree of economic integration between these competitive superpowers is something that's quite different. So plenty of complexity and plenty of risks, but not yet a third world war, let alone a cold one.
Rebecca?
I think what's kind of interesting when you do focus groups of Australians about the extent to which they think we might be headed towards a kind of global conflict. Their biggest concern really, other than China, and there's concern around China, is that we might be headed towards a kind of global conflict around things like water, and that those kinds of scarce resources in the future might, caused by climate change, might actually bring those things about. But when it comes to global conflicts, I've got to say most of the Australian community are kind of just really focused on domestic concerns. So we saw a lot of support for the Ukraine against Russia when hostilities first happened. We're starting to see that decline. At the moment, we've got a community divided on what's happening in Gaza. And so Australians don't tend to think an enormous amount about global wars, which means, of course, that we don't turn our minds towards what the government's doing, which is probably a problem.
Jioji, obviously, in our own region, there's the threat of a potential looming conflict. The Pacific, obviously, is being wooed by the West. Australia is part of that, and obviously China.
Yes, and I think that's something that in the Pacific we're conscious of, is the different countries, different entities that are trying to compete for our attention. And I think that in and of itself is also creating levels of conflict within each of the countries in the islands. And I think that then creates a level of uncertainty. Just to the point where you're saying around some of the global conflicts, I think one of the key things that I think we need to be mindful, especially in Australia, is the humanity associated with, but also what flow-on effect that has for refugees and asylum seekers. And I think that's when Australia starts to become more interested in this, is that then there's a flow-on effect, especially even with what's happening in the Pacific, let alone what might be happening overseas in other countries and territories.
And you can have your say on our online poll. We're asking you, should federal government terms be extended from 3 years to 4 in line with states and territories? You can cast your votes anonymously on the Q&A Facebook and YouTube accounts, or the ABC News X and Instagram accounts, and we'll bring you the results later. Next, we'll hear from Alexander Zaitsev.
My question is for Olga Oleinikova. I was born and grew up in Russia, and I feel horrible about what my country has birthed is committing in Ukraine, and I stand with people of Ukraine in this war. How do you think the President Zelensky will handle the upcoming the election that is supposed to be held this year but could not be because of the martial law? It seems that the war could last for many more months, and how will it impact the democracy in Ukraine?
Yes, Alexis, thank you so much, first of all, for your support for Ukraine. Yeah, Ukraine has been in this full-scale invasion for the last 2 years, right? And actually, we've been in a war since 2014, right? So for us, for whole Ukraine, it's a long process, it's not just 2 years, right? When you talk about Zelensky came to power in 2019, right? So he came just before the war, then the war started under his presidency, and what is happening now, this should have been an elections, right? Scheduled for March 2024, so next month. He gave a press conference, I think, in November when he said that, they had internal discussions and they all think that it's not good time for having elections. First of all, under martial law, you can't have elections. Second thing, he spoke in interviews about that even if the elections will be held, he's certain that he will be elected again. Again, Zelensky had a lot of support and has a lot of support still, but he has some challenges as well, right, on the way, and we should be, open about that. He's done tremendous things for Ukraine to gain, Ukraine's attention, put us, he helped us because I'm Ukrainian, right? I live here in Australia for the last 10 years, but I still, when I speak about Ukraine, I say myself because I still have family there. He did a lot to win the media war. I think Ukraine fantastically won it, even in first year. But what's happening on the ground, it's, we all can feel that in the last 6 months, there was not so many gains from, both sides. And how long it will last, how long, Ukraine will pay this price, that's the big thing. So, yes, elections are off for now. And there is a united front on this, but we'll see. We'll keep watching what's happening, right? And technically, under the Constitution... Yeah, sorry.
No. Peter, if I can bring you in. I mean, at times of war, is this what happens? Freedoms are curtailed?
Well, being British, we talk about the Second World War a lot. I mean, remember Churchill got elected, got booted out of office just after Germany being defeated in Europe. So politics is highly unpredictable, as all of you know. I think that the biggest challenge is how the fact that Ukraine wants to postpone elections for very obvious reasons, in terms of how do you actually conduct it if you have men and servicewomen on front lines, how and where do they vote and in what kind of format. The worry is that gets exploited by misinformation, by agitation, and particularly in Congress in the United States, where the worry is that those kind of noises about democracy being pushed into something different, martial law, can be very easily exploited in the election cycle that's coming up in November. And of course, will be music to ears in Moscow and perhaps beyond too. So I think it's very uncertain. I don't, it's up to the Ukrainian people to decide how to run their own choices of leaders. But we'll see how that logjam gets pushed out.
How
I think
much
in Europe,
support do you think Zelensky still has on the ground?
I'd probably ask Olga to have an opinion rather than...
Olga, do you think he's still...
Look, like, he's a leader, right? People are united around the one single aim to win the war, right? He is like leading the nation to win the war. Yes, there are hiccups, there are challenges, definitely. Like, imagine last, I don't know.
Well, he got rid of his military chief, for instance.
Yes, that's right.
More popular than him.
That's right. Yeah, again, there's conversations about that, right? And there is possibly Aristovich, another guy who was very popular in the beginning of war, who is now somewhere in the US probably, and delivering completely different narrative. I think he's as well potentially another candidate. Again, yes, there are some tensions in the Ukrainian government, but I think everything goes secondary after the main goal to win the war and to return the territorial integrity to the 1991 right territorial how Ukraine looked before. Like at its independence before 2014.
Malcolm Turnbull, if you look at what's happening in the United States, obviously, where this has become such a polarised, partisan issue, is the West's support for Ukraine wavering, and what are the dangers of that?
Well, the danger is that Putin will get what he wants. I mean, Putin is a ruthless dictator who has invaded Ukraine, and he is seeking to demonstrate that might is right. That's what he's seeking to do. He's trampling on a democracy. It's an illegal, criminal, brutal invasion. The Ukrainian people have inspired the world with their courage, and the leadership of their president, Zelensky, has been an inspiration to all of us, as it has been to Ukrainians. Without the support of the West, they will struggle to defend themselves. Regrettably, the Republican Party under Donald Trump, and particularly the right wing of the Republican Party, are very sympathetic to Vladimir Putin. I mean, I've been with Trump and Putin. Trump is in awe of Putin. When you see Trump with Putin, as I have on a few occasions, he's like the 12-year-old boy that goes to high school and meets the captain of the football team. My hero. It is really creepy. It's really creepy. Now,
and that struck you at the time?
Oh, absolutely. It struck everybody. It was like you could touch it. It was creepy. The creepiness was palpable.
Are you trying to say they're having a bromance?
No, I'm not saying. I'm just telling you what I saw. And you saw that in that press conference they did I think in Helsinki. You saw a similar thing. Now, the sad thing is that you've got the right wing of the Republican Party. You saw this with Tucker Carlson doing that sycophantic kind of non-interview with Vladimir Putin. I mean, it is a
half-an-hour history lesson.
It is terrifying, and there is the scary thing is that for countries like Australia and many European countries, we may find ourselves. Are we going to find ourselves not dealing just with two autocracies in Russia and China? But what is Trump's America going to look like? This is a guy leading a party that is no longer committed to democracy as we understand it.
That's it. Look, I may know that there are questions around Trump, but I have to pick you up on that because that's quite a statement. You think that America is genuinely sliding into becoming a country that's an autocracy that's no longer a democracy?
Well, it's if by democracy you mean a country that's governed by the rule of law, yeah, for sure. I mean, Donald Trump does not believe the law applies to him. Donald Trump lost the 2020 election and refused to accept it, and you know, sooled a mob, encouraged a mob to try to overthrow the constitutional process in the Congress, tried to overthrow his own constitution. I mean,
and yet he's outpolling Biden at the moment. And so
precisely,
there is a contradiction here, right? If you look at the democracy in itself, people are expressing that look, they're interested in him.
Tyrants are often popular. You see, the key to democracy, liberal democracy, is that it empowers the majority, but it also, through the rule of law, constrains the majority. And if you get to the point where anybody who can muster a majority, and I don't think Trump can do that, by the way, but anyone who can muster a majority is given absolute power and then can do whatever they like to the minority, that's not a democracy. That is a tyranny. That is an autocracy, even if it's got the support of 51% of the population. That is not what makes a democracy. A democracy, as we understand it, is one where the rule of law protects all citizens and the rule of law applies to all citizens, whether they're the president or the prime minister or an ordinary, elector.
We'll keep this discussion going with a question from John Spear.
Why is the world standing by when Mr Netanyahu, who took 5 elections to be allowed to form the current Israeli government, making inhumane decisions in mass slaughter of innocent people, his people?
Well, I'm going to pick up with you, Malcolm Turnbull. That question was
I didn't hear the first part of it.
He asked about Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, sure. That's another one of my...
well, what is your assessment of the way he's running...
Political colleagues, I spend the sense of being a leader of a country at the time I was
What do you make of the
PM.
way he's running the war?
Well, look, the October 7 attack by Hamas, that brutal, violent, criminal, obscene assault on Israel that took over 1,200 lives, that changed Israel. It shocked the whole world. But what it was designed as a provocation. It was designed. I said this in the statement that we drafted for a number of former PMs. Hamas wanted the Israeli Defence Force to invade Gaza and to kill Gazan civilians. They wanted that. It was a provocation. And so the problem that Israel has is the country has been shattered, not just by the deaths, I mean, that they are bad enough, but by the fact that all the things they believed in, the strength of their defence force, missing in action, the far-sightedness of their intelligence services, didn't see it coming, the superiority of their technology. Hey, 3,000 terrorists armed with Kalashnikovs and a D9 bulldozer got through the fence and invaded their country. I mean, this is mind-blowing. And so the reaction, the violent, the invasion of Gaza, all of that was what Hamas sought to provoke Israel into doing.
And so should Israel not have taken the provocation?
Well, I mean, Tom Friedman in the New York Times has, pointed to the way India was very restrained under Manmohan Singh after the terrorist attacks by Lashkar-e-Toiba in 2008. I don't think Netanyahu could... I don't think any Israeli government could have not responded in the kinetic way they did, but...
But has it been overreach?
Well, the question you have to ask yourself is firstly, is the price in Palestinian civilian lives now so high that the claim that the Israeli Defence Forces make that they're doing everything they can to protect human life is no longer credible? And what is it doing? And this is from an Israeli point of view. Their question has to be, are they losing so much public support in the world today that they are, in effect, achieving what Hamas wanted to achieve, which is the, Israel
and is
being...
it your view that that's what's happening?
I fear that the Hamas would see what has happened as being entirely in accordance with their provocation. It is, look, the truest thing you can say about the Middle East is the only thing in abundant supply is bad options. And it's very tough. I don't see any good options there.
No.
And I think the question for Israel and for its friends and, and supporters, as Australians are friends of Israel, and certainly I count myself as a friend of Israel. The question is not whether we can see a solution, but whether we are at risk of making a bad problem worse.
Rebecca, this has played out spectacularly, of course, in Australia, in the arts community. More stories today about really a breaking point inside institutions and communities. This question essentially asks the question about Benjamin Netanyahu and the support some countries, including Australia, have provided. Is something shifting? Is there a turning point in terms of the support countries like ours are willing to provide?
What I can observe and what was kind of interesting to me looking at when we first started to hear about what was happening in Israel and Gaza is it came very hard on the heels of the referendum on The Voice, which was, I know it sounds like it's a tangent, but what was really clear doing a lot of work on that was how polarisation in the Australian community, which we're seeing in all advanced democracies, is in so many ways the enemy of good sense, of reform and progress. So what is happening in the Australian community, which if you look at polling about what should happen, it's almost like immediately split down the line. Half of the community think one thing and half of the community think the other. But the reality is that you've got very, very highly engaged minorities, people who absolutely think that everything Israel is doing is unjustified and unashamedly out there with the Palestinian cause. And you have people who think that the Palestinians brought it entirely upon themselves, egged on, I've got to say, by certain parts of the media. It's become a partisan issue rather than an issue of sense and understanding history. And the vast majority of Australians turning away. Right. And not knowing what to think. And that doesn't get reflected in surveys that say 50% think one, 50% think the other. And it's that polarisation, it's that kind of, the kind of extremes on either side that see it with a complete lens of ideology and everybody else thinking, I need to walk away from this because it's too overwhelming.
Jioji, you work at a university where, of course, this is one of the biggest issues among students who have become very active on it. Are you seeing a real split in your own classrooms on campus?
Yeah, there's been statements that have been put out by the university around making sure that we're creating safe learning environments for everybody. The university has made a clear statement that they're not making a specific statement about this particular matter. And it's in alignment with the ability to have robust, critical conversations. And I think that's what's important. I think we do need to have critical conversations that are nuanced, that allow people to express their opinions in a safe way, whilst also ensuring that we're listening, that we're not just sort of virtue signalling, we're actually listening to the realities associated with what's happening in these particular places. And so I think it's really, really important that we do continue to encourage those particular conversations, those critical and nuanced conversations, as opposed to just simple, I'll take this side, I'll take that side, because those binary conversations do not work.
Peter Frankopan, that question from our questioner was essentially about Benjamin Netanyahu and support for him and the way that he's running this war. What do you make of what Malcolm Turnbull's really shared with us, the view that the way that Israel has responded to this provocation is becoming now the issue because of the incredible loss of life?
Well, I'd probably take a slightly different view, which is that what this shows is that no one is able to put a brake on Netanyahu. The only influence, we can all have our opinions and we can set fire to our campuses and try and listen. I'd absolutely think that's right about how important it is to respect other people's opinions, but it doesn't doesn't move the needle in terms of changing policy, Netanyahu and his cabinet. And I think that has come as a shock to all of us who thought that we lived in a global commons where the Security Council at the UN, where the ability to have conversations that would restrain, and it's clear that the only power that is potentially able to bring Netanyahu back in is the US. And Netanyahu's not even listening to Biden. So the only options left to Biden are pretty cataclysmic in terms of what he can do. And the question, I guess, now is whether the US will play some of those cards in terms of restricting aid completely, potentially. We saw the drafting of a ceasefire at the UN, but there are limited abilities to try to influence what it is that Netanyahu and his government are doing. And that, I think, poses all sorts of problems for conflicts in other parts of the world too. But the powerlessness of us to be able to actually make our voices heard in a meaningful way is pretty surprising and shocking, I think.
Now I'd like to bring in Emily Horsley.
Over the last 12 years in Australian politics, we've seen a trend where Prime Ministers tend to serve one term or less. In the panel's opinion, does this make it harder for governments to create long-lasting change for the complex issues Australia faces, such as those surrounding climate change or the increasing cost of living?
Well, we did hold on to a Prime Minister for a full term. And look, that's exceeding our UK friends.
That's much better than we've done.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
So,
We'd like to learn.
Credit where credit's due. But Rebecca,
Canberra.
on the question of reform and what you can achieve, does it make things more difficult?
Look, I mean, the problem is not necessarily with the Australian community on this. The problem is the nature of the political parties, and it's been something that's happened on both sides of politics as well. And in some ways it's because, well, certainly with certain prime ministers, the kind of prime minister making the kinds of decisions that the majority of people want don't end up being popular with their party. So there's something, I think, wrong with the very nature of the two major parties. And kind of interestingly, today the Edelman Trust survey came out. It's always kind of fascinating for sociologists like me to kind of see what it says. And one of the things that's clear in advanced democracies is that conventional politicians are becoming less and less trustworthy. So it's almost like we trust conventional politicians and people like Biden, who looks like a conventional politician, less and less. We think we want people to disrupt the system, except we don't always want what happens when they disrupt the system. So, look, democracy is a kind of flux, and the kind of the revolving door of prime ministers in Australia is a bit of a sign of democracy under siege in some ways.
Your system is quite wild, isn't it? It is true. I mean, the Liz Truss timeframe was, whoa! I thought we were quite stable after that.
I think I'm right in saying if Liz Truss lives till she's 90, she's going to go to more cenotaph memorials of the First World War than she served days in office. I mean, look, I've got two views. One is that it's a brutal system, politics, but it works. You know, we break things, we're messy, but I work on countries where people don't have a right to vote. And the fact that we have a kind of Netflix version of politics where people are attacking each other and it's blue on blue and party on party, you know, it's not a great message. But, you know, we still are free to be able to make those choices and elect our leaders, and that's something which is underpriced for most voters. Second, I would make the point that although democracy is under siege in developed economies, particularly Australia, United States, United Kingdom, all over Europe, the decline of confidence and beliefs in the importance of having elections, we're below 50% in almost every single developed economy. You find in some of the biggest democracies on earth today, approval ratings for politicians that most Australian prime ministers, former prime ministers, British ones would never dream of. So I think I'm right in saying there's not a leader in post in a developed Western economy where the approval ratings are more than 40%. In places like Indonesia, with Prabowo, in places like India, you find leaders who are in the 80s and higher. And
why?
Well, if you were, I mean, I would defer to sociologists, but, you know, one answer might be that young people feel that if tomorrow is going to be better than it is today, then the system does work. And probably one of the problems we face in a lot of developed economies in the West is that tomorrow looks worse than today. And so you lose confidence, you lose faith, you lose trust, and you blame other people. You blame politicians. And, you know, a lot of my friends stand for Parliament or in Parliament, and it's a tough, difficult job, and you get attacked by everybody. But I think that the process of trying to safeguard some of these things, we should perhaps be sometimes a bit more generous about how difficult some of those big decisions are.
Olga, I just want to bring you in.
Yeah, I just reacted to this, you know, that like 80 years plus, right? That's what we get as leaders. I had a class today at UTS, and we talk about elections and how they fail and how young people are no longer participating in the traditional way of, you know, entering politics. They're no longer joining political parties. They are choosing alternatives, right? They create social movements. They join protests. They, you know, create online petitions. They lost the trust in a way in the system. Not everybody, but there is a trend happening globally, right? Yes, Australia solves this problem of, you know, electorate showing up to elections because it's obligatory, right? But in Europe, and you would know, right? There's a big problem making people show up and like cast their vote. How can we talk about democracy and representation in a way, right? If just half of the population doesn't show up to elections, right? What representation is it? What type of democracy it is, right? Yes, that's why I reacted to this, you know, 80 plus, because that's the reality. And, you know, we have young people here in the audience. They can reflect on their own strategies, how they change the world, how they see the world, you know, and the impact.
Just before the last election, I did a project on first-time voters, and there was lots of criticism of democracy, but there weren't fascists in that room. They were like, we've got to make democracy better. But at the heart of that, of why they were jaundiced about democracy, was that the top three issues for the majority of young Australians, the surveys show, is housing affordability, climate and mental health. And interestingly, when I started my career 20 years ago interviewing young people, they were the same issues. So they're asking questions about, are our institutions and are our political parties fit for purpose to actually try and find a way to solve the most pressing issues for our generation? And so it's a questioning, and an important questioning, but there's not a kind of rise of fascism amongst young people. There's a how can we make democracy better?
And Jioji, is that what you pick up at university too? Like, the mental health question is huge, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. I think people want to be able to rely on services, but more so funding that is consistent. If we continue to chop and change policy settings and legislation that is not responsive to the health needs of people, especially around mental health and wellbeing, then that's going to have a bigger impact on the consistency of service delivery. So for me, politics in terms, it really reflects, again, the consistency of care that democratically elected governments should be showing to the people that voted in the first place. And I think that's what matters, is about being able to ensure that we are providing that consistency rather than just whiz-bang election promises that are not sustainable.
Malcolm Turnbull, I mean, the elephant in the room, you didn't quite last
Thank you.
term. I mean, someone's just got to, you know, there is actually someone on our panel.
I'll take that as a comment.
It's a comment. No, but on the policy consequences.
Well, I had to say that I'm the only guy with silver hair sitting in the chair here. You know, it's very sort of resonant.
Longer than 7 weeks. But on the policy front, at the moment, there's a big debate on EVs and that policy on electrifying the nation. These things are very, very... We're basically having the same fights in some ways that we were having when you were in power, right? Yeah,
well, I mean, can I make a... Yes, well, the answer is yes. There is the sort of the you know, fact-free debate about energy that you see in some quarters. I mean, you know, we now have... I saw Twiggy Forrest, or Dr Forrest, I should say, was very eloquent at the press club today talking about the stupidity of those who are advocating small modular nuclear reactors as the answer.
Well, the Liberal Party today has been quoting this news poll showing young people are more open to nuclear.
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, of course. Well, that the reality is there isn't one such small modular reactor in existence other than in Russia and China. We could always get one of those, I suppose, scatter a few Russian reactors through the countryside. That would be... I think the Labor Party would encourage Peter Dutton to adopt that and as a policy. But the fact is these SMRs, so-called, A, don't exist, and B, all of the evidence about nuclear power is that it is, you know, massively expensive. I mean, I say this as would have seen in the news today, Lucy and I are developing some big renewable energy projects, so I'm, very much in the renewables camp and, have been notoriously for a long time. But look, the truth is we have abundant sources of wind and solar in Australia, and as long as we build the pumped hydro or set up the batteries, combination of both, to store that electricity when it's in abundance so that we've got it, when the sun isn't shining, we can have cheaper electricity, zero-emission electricity, and all we've got to do is get on with it. And what you're getting from the right of politics here and their friends in the media is the usual old BS designed to stop the progress towards moving away from fossil fuels. It is just distraction. And you're right, absolutely. Have I seen that film before? I have.
But hang on a minute, back to the film, right? In the Dunkley by-election, which is this weekend, it's obviously the biggest issue is cost of living, hands down, no one disagrees. But obviously they're running other lines too about, cars becoming more expensive. A lot of people drive.
So we have the same fuel efficiency standards as the European Union and the United States, like literally pretty much all of the developed world, so that in fact all of the cars that can be made there can be sold in Australia, as though that is some kind of, terrible assault. I mean, it's like
yeah, but if Albo gets a whack this weekend, right?
Yeah.
Like, if
will the Labor Party lose their nerve and back off? That's the question, is it? Well, I mean, that is your question. And the answer is, I don't know. They might, but they shouldn't. I mean, I think the reality is that the force of logic, cheaper, power, is on the side of the renewable revolution. Look at what the CSIRO's Gen Cost report comes out every year. Tells it the same story every year. The cheapest form of new electricity is renewables plus storage. And that's been so for a long time. And everything else is essentially an attempt to deny reality and create a distraction because they want, the opposition under Mr Dutton, wants to have divide on this issue. And that's it.
If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A live with Jioji Ravulo, Olga Oleinikova, Malcolm Turnbull, Rebecca Huntley and Peter Frankopan. Plenty to get to tonight. Here's Lynn Bruce.
For the whole panel, what exactly is a climate forward economic agenda, and why is or should Australia be responsible for Pacific Islands when we can't take care of our own population adequately?
Jioji?
Great question. Round of applause question.
And very well delivered.
I know. Very, very well delivered. Look, I agree. I think if we look at a lot of the different policy settings and, again, the legislation that we have in place for lots of different matters here in Australia, we do need to question what is then Australia's role in the region, especially in the Pacific. Like, for example, with what happened with The Voice and how we interact and work alongside First Nations communities in Australia. If we can't get that right here in Australia, how are we going to get it right in the Pacific in regards to any sort of consultation and understanding of the impacts associated with climate change and inaction that I think is happening in and across the region? And so we do need to look at ourselves in Australia more seriously if we are going to set up a good example in the region. And we need to be collaborative. We do need to understand that part of the broader agenda of being a neighbour in the Pacific is to be collective and collaborative, similar to what we do in Indigenous Pacific cultures. We're all about the community. We're all about working together. Where is Australia? Come on, Australia. Get to the conversation in creating that shared approach to climate change and how we can respond more proactively rather than reactively.
How could we do a better job?
Have conversations with our Pacific people on the ground. I think we do lip service. I think we say, yes, we talk to the leaders, yes, we talk to the activists, but we're actually not listening. We're not actually hearing what they're saying. We're not actually hearing how we are being left behind with all the different impacts that climate change is having in the region. So it's really, really important.
We did announce a small number of refugees coming to Australia. Was that the sort of approach we should be doing?
I think that is helpful, but if we are going to bring climate refugees from the Pacific to Australia, are we then responding effectively to the cultural differences in our education system, in our health system, in our legal system, in our welfare system? Because you can bring people into the country, but are our social systems effectively responding to those areas of diversity and need? So I think that's also that we need to be mindful of that. It's nice to say, yeah, come to Australia, but we know from seasonal workers that are coming into the country that we're having lots of issues with the social and welfare needs of seasonal workers. We're saying come into the country, help it stimulate our economy. Yes, you'll send remittances back to the islands, but we're seeing some real issues in the communities in which our Pacific people are residing here in Australia. So we need to be proactive in that as well.
Peter Frankopan, this is obviously a broader question about, should we look after our own backyards? If China's not doing enough on climate change, what's the point of us doing, accelerating? How do you see it? I mean, should we be putting more effort into these Pacific relationships? Is that just about putting off China? Should we be actually investing in the climate change programs just because they're the right thing to do?
Well, so my label is I'm Professor of Global History, which that doesn't mean I know about everything and every different region.
Actually, your second version of the Silk Roads is all about the contemporary. Be honest about it.
Look, so, I mean, for example, as of 2012, Sub-Saharan Africa uses as much electricity every year as New York City, right? So there's inequalities are still structurally connected to deep history. Today, Africa is a single continent. It's very complicated to even think of the geography to define all these different peoples and their identities and so on, but attracts less than 3% of all global finance into climate renewables. And even though Africa should be home to about 60% of the best space for solar and all kind of renewable energy. So how do you fix that? Well, it's to incentivize businesses to be able to use free markets, to be able to encourage people to invest in people's long-term futures. And that doesn't seem to me either complicated, difficult, or even unprofitable. It doesn't have to be done at a loss. The ways in which you can invest in people's long terms seems to me entirely progressive. But unfortunately, people chase short-term returns close to home, and our consumption patterns are out of control. Some of us would say it's because governments haven't addressed the ways in which we don't tax properly, whether it's the fossil fuel industries or other consumptive industries too. And there are ways in which that carrot and stick has to be calibrated. But I struggle to see many systems and many countries that get that balance correct and right. And I am involved in lots of conversations like Rebecca is, and I know Malcolm and others around the table are too, where, I'm not here to defend how other people make choices, but it doesn't seem hard that we should be able to work together in better ways. And that's been one of the questions we've talked about in every single topic we've raised so far this evening, is how do we find a way where we can listen to each other and find ways to look after each other, invest. No one on this planet wants a warmer Earth. No one wants more microplastics in placentas of women who just had given birth. No one wants more air quality pollution that shortens people's lives. So how do we try to think about bringing people on together rather than protecting and putting up walls? And those conversations seem to be going in the wrong direction as far as I can see.
You think they're going in the wrong direction?
Absolutely. I mean, the COP summits, they do something. They are quite useful. There are always helpful noises. But last year we drilled globally more oil than ever before. The ways in which we polluted greater than ever before. Across all of Southeast Asia as a whole, 99.9% of the population live with air quality that's below World Health Organization standards. In most cities in India, with populations of more than 1 million people, average life expectancies are 5 to 6 years shorter than they would be if people breathed clean air. And no one wants that. No one wants these things to get worse. No one wants environmental pollutions and consumption to go down. But like Rebecca says, we're living in a warming world where water, where food availability, basic calories, air quality start to be things that we shouldn't be thinking about how do we address those. No. As a historian, it's how have we got to the point where we live in a world that we've polluted so badly.
Rebecca, there are winners and losers in these transactions, and that, of course, is where the friction of politics, that's the fault line, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that essentially the problem, that politics has mismanaged the winners and the losers part of the story?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, to the point about where do I think... I mean, this is what I think about and write all the time, so it's quite hard to be pithy about it, Patricia, but this is what I would say.
You're going to give it a red hot go.
It kind of doesn't matter where you sit on energy and climate in Australia. You have seen this kind of one step forward, 4 steps back, fall on the ground in a suit and yell into your mobile phone, get up again, walk forward. I mean, all of this kind of that partisan politics has destroyed any kind of policy framework or forward movement. What do we know? The Australian community know that renewable energy is probably the energy of the future, and we have to go in that direction. They know it makes sense. It makes sense for our domestic economy, and whether or not it does anything about global warming, the vast majority of people hope that it will, but really they understand that's where we need to go. The most of the anxiety from the majority of the people, except for this kind of galvanised minority who are talking about nuclear energy and all the rest of it, is how do we do it in a way that bestows community benefit to everybody? Not just people who are going to make a lot of money out of this, but are we going to get local jobs? Are we going to get cheaper energy? Are we going to get manufacturing really coming back here? They're asking, searching questions. Are we going to destroy the natural environment when we put transmission lines down and all the rest of it? Those are reasonable questions to ask, but people are asking them in earnest because they want us to go in that direction rather than faff around and go around and cycle back and all the rest of it, which is what has happened with energy policy for the last 10 years plus, and it's why we're in the position we are in now.
Less faffing around is what you're hearing.
We need engineering and economics, not ideology and idiocy.
I've heard that before. Next we'll
An old
hear
one, but a good one.
from Zoe Patterson.
Donald Trump looks set to be the next US Republican candidate. Given his apparent low regard for democracy and his, potentially interest in Putin, what would a second Trump presidency mean for government and policy in the US, and how does that affect Australia?
Yeah. The Australia part of that question is a really interesting one. Malcolm Turnbull, I'm going to start with you, and Olga, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Putin part.
Well, look, I think it raises some very big challenges. We have, in part because of the AUKUS decision that Morrison took and that the Albanese government's adopted, we have made ourselves much more dependent on the United States at a time when the United States, particularly if Trump becomes president, will be much less reliable. It's going to raise some very real issues. The challenge is going to be for the Australian government to stand up for Australia and to not back down or get into a sort of sycophantic posture vis-a-vis Trump. Trump is a bully. He encourages people to suck up to him. Notoriously, I didn't do that. I mean, that was partly my personality and partly circumstance, but I think it was a good thing. But, we have to get used to the fact that the United States may not be aligned on the same values in quite the same way as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that's a reality we've got to live with.
Scott Morrison did an exit interview with the Nine Papers, and he said Donald Trump poses no threat to Australia's national security.
Oh, sure. So he thinks, what if Donald Trump forces Ukraine to surrender to Putin? What if Donald Trump pulls out of NATO?
And you think there's a live option, possibilities?
I think Donald Trump has threatened to pull out of NATO. Donald Trump stood up in front of an audience and said that he said to an unnamed European leader, if you don't spend more money on defence, I'm going to encourage, Putin to have a go at you. That's more or less what he said. I mean, look, Trump rattled every single cage, every single alliance. He is attracted to dictators and tyrants like Kim Jong-un, like Xi Jinping, like Putin, and he threatened to undermine or pull out of America's longest-standing alliances. Now, if Scott Morrison thinks none of that is a threat to Australian security, well, I'm afraid to say, not for the first time, I disagree with my distinguished
Olga, not for the first time. Olga, I want to bring you in.
Yeah.
Malcolm Turnbull painted a picture a little earlier of Donald Trump being in awe of Putin. Do you see a potential Donald Trump presidency as being a risk to the people of Ukraine?
Look, until today, US is one of the big donor, right, and funder of support, of Western support, right? So US is like a leading Western ally in the whole kind of Western bloc, right? Biden was one of the first who actually came down to Ukraine, and he posted photos, I think, on Instagram yesterday or something, that he was the first one on the ground in Ukraine when the war started. To say that we will be there for you, will support Ukrainian people no matter what. So what this change will, and already we see the signs of what is happening, right? So we don't get the promised support to Ukraine, right? Everything is withheld, and hopefully we'll get it. But again, there is this tendencies, right, for Ukraine to become, like, now we're bundled with Israel, right, as a expense item, let's put it this way, right, in US support for foreign, countries. So, I mean, Ukraine is no longer, it looks like, becoming a one big, issue to support and to assist democratic world, right, with the fight for democracy. I mean, yes, right, if Donald Trump already made some statements
to Ukraine's ability to resist this war of Donald Trump's election?
Yes, I mean, we'll see, right? But from what he's saying and from his behavior in the last years, right, we can see that, he will not, support things on this scale. And I'm not sure if he will be like the best friend, right? Because US was one of the best friends of Ukrainian struggle in this war. He said that he knows how to end war in Ukraine in 30 days or something like that, right? So, I mean, again...
It was 30 minutes.
30 minutes, sorry, 30 days.
And how would he do that? I mean, Peter, have you studied his strategy?
Like Orson Welles said, even a stop clock is right twice a day. And, I never, ever thought I would defend Donald Trump. And I'm not defending Donald Trump, but he's not wrong about NATO underinvesting in their armed forces. He's not wrong about Europe getting American taxpayers to pay for the security envelope across Europe. He might have said it in a chaotic way. He might mean he's going to pull out. It might be that cataclysm comes towards us. But we in Europe have got lazy by underinvesting in a long-term future. Mm-hmm. And that's a charge that could be laid at other governments around the world who now have to scale up things like navies, which take a long time to build, very expensive. The capacity to be able to do that is tough. But to prove that the stop clock thing is right, Putin was asked last week whether he'd prefer Biden or Trump in the White House. And Putin said, I prefer Biden because Trump is highly volatile. And again, most people would think that Putin and Trump will get on like a house on fire. But if you're in Moscow's shoes, a predictable, reliable way that the machine works has its obvious advantages. So, I think that Trump is going to be difficult and dangerous. He's extremely dogmatic. He doesn't listen to advisors. As Malcolm said, he doesn't respect the rule of law. Look at the fines that are piled up towards him and the appeals. I think that's a real problem for the leader of the free world. And as someone who grew up thinking what the West does and what the United States leads in terms of freedoms, its soft power, you look at what the US produces from Netflix through to Taylor Swift, God bless her, here in Sydney this evening. It's the stock market in the US is the highest it's ever been, more or less, this evening. Everything about the US should speak confidence, and yet there's a crisis in the US that, for some reason, Trump has led his believers to think that America is a power that is failing, fading, and needs to be regalvanized. And so, I think that it's going to be tricky when he comes back in. But those of us outside,
when he comes back
I think it looks like it. You never know. It looks like it, but we should be prepared. We should be prepared.
Yeah, I think he's certainly even money at this stage. I just say this about Trump: he's not a warmonger. Okay, he's essentially at heart an isolationist, and Peter's absolutely right that the Europeans have not spent enough on their own defence, and they have got, if you like, complacent under the American security umbrella. But the fact remains is that the way Trump operates is he encourages our adversaries. He is not, who is the leader that he most admires in Europe? It's Viktor Orban, who is not exactly a model for liberal democracy. In fact, he prides himself on running an illiberal democracy in Hungary.
And was holding off on support for Ukraine as well.
Yeah, exactly. Again, you've got to be careful not to get in Trump derangement syndrome where everything Trump says is there because he says it is therefore wrong. But nonetheless, the idea that it would be a safer world for any of us, let alone Australia, with Donald Trump at the helm in the White House, is very, very naive.
Jioji?
What I worry about is the conservative politicking that is coming from the United States and potentially what might happen here in Australia, the way in which I think conservative politics here are leaning towards the Trump sort of approach. And for me, that threatens a lot of human rights and civil liberties, especially for, diverse community groups. Shout out to our queer communities. Shout out to our queer communities.
Mardi Gras
this weekend. Yay!
And the queer community, can I say, is having a pretty tough time at the moment.
That's exactly right. And I think that's why we need to be conscious of what happens in America will not just from an economic point of view have a flow-on effect, but the morality and the ethics that we see from America does have a flow-on effect to what might happen in Australia as well.
And we can bring you the result of our online poll now. We asked you, should federal government terms be extended from 3 years to 4 in line with states and territories? More than 4,700 of you responded. Here's how you voted. 67% said yes, you're not into elections, I see. 25% said no, 8% are unsure. Now we have a question from Orlando Throsby.
How is the teaching of history, specifically Australian history, changing in the education system, and is it for the better? Some argue that history should foster a sense of shared pride for one's own country, as well as acknowledging the bad. Is that being done? What are Peter's thoughts on teaching history or the teaching of history in the UK?
OK, we'll start with Peter because you've name-checked him.
Oh, and I'm a guest. I should go last. We should hear about Australian history teaching, shouldn't we?
You go first.
Yeah.
The heat is on.
So I don't think history should teach national pride. I think it should teach the truth.
Yeah.
I think it should teach, what is, and teach how you have hierarchies of factors that explain causality. And I think histories are typically about excluding people. It's about excluding women, it's about excluding different identities, different regions, people who have oral traditions, and I think we live in a vibrant world where my colleagues are a golden age of history writing because we understand that previous generations have cut people out, whether it's different sexualities, etc. There's a long, long list. Could we do better? Always. How do we do that? Well, it's hard. It's hard to do that in a noisy space of academia, but there are so many people who are doing their best. And I think if you're a young person or an old person reading histories, the choices that you have, the abilities to engage with new ideas, I think it's phenomenal. And, my own work is involving lots of new sciences as well, lots of new ways of looking at the past. So my job isn't to make people feel good about themselves or to teach them about their country. It's about opening up the world in front of them. And if you can do that well and tell a narrative that gets you onto programmes like this, then it shows why humanities degrees are worth doing.
If only someone would make them cheaper. There is a proposal before the Parliament. Rebecca.
Am I able to ask what it concerns you? Like, what is driving that question about your concern about how history is taught at school?
I suppose going through school in the country and then now studying history at university, I love learning about Indigenous history and culture, but especially coming from the country and then coming to the city, it was amazing seeing Sydney and what an amazing city it was. And I realised I hadn't exactly been taught, or not that I've been taught, but I'd like to know more about how Australia was founded in that sense, with a wonderful democracy, although maybe it needs tweaking here and there.
You want a bit of a balance of the good and the bad.
We do have a wonderful democracy.
Yeah.
No, we actually, I give you some positive news to end up. For example, at UTS, we have introduced new subjects on Indigenous history, and they are over-enrolled. So I should say, so there is definitely demand. It's interesting that you have this question because there is definitely demand in Australians to understand, the Indigenous history specifically. We have some subjects on this. So I think it's a really good question, and I think young people are eager to take the subjects, right? Because they're electives, right? Let's say.
All I can say is I'm 52, and when I did history when I was, however many generations ago, we were taught when Australian history was about bushrangers and people that got lost a lot, white guys with beards that got lost all the time. And I think there was,
It's a big country. It's really easy to get
And that was
lost.
it. We weren't taught about the Constitution, we weren't taught about civics. And I think all I remember once is a teacher once saying to me, about that all the First Nations people in Tasmania were killed, and that was it. It was all the Indigenous history I knew. And so I got a very boring and very partial view of Australian history. And then I had to kind of catch up later on in life. So I kind of think that we can tell a really dynamic, interesting and rich and true story of Australian history that inspires us to continue to read as we go on. Not just the books of Peter Fitzsimons, but the books of other historians.
What was your history education like at school?
The same sort of thing, and I think that's why it's so important that we are speaking truth to the history of our nation, our First Nations. The history is associated with the realities, what is actually happening. But it's the same sort of with the global scale. We need to understand the impacts of colonialism in the Pacific region, the occupations that are happening in different parts of the world still, again with Gaza and in West Papua. So I think that unlocks critical conversations and one that everyone should be involved in.
That's a very positive note to end on. You've just made me feel hopeful. Also, can I say...
You're welcome.
I do think the kids are all right, though.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
My daughter came back the other day from school and knew the year of colonisation, Federation, the history of First Australians, and I was like, they're doing a good job at school. Thank you for being such a great panel.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And that's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Jioji Ravulo, Olga Oleinikova, Malcolm Turnbull, Rebecca Huntley and Peter Frankopan.
Thank you, Olga.
Thank you for sharing your stories and your questions. Next week, I'll be live from Melbourne with a panel including, but not limited to, Industrial Relations Minister Tony Burke, American writer Nathan Thrall and lawyer and human rights advocate Nigel Nguyen. Head to our website to register to be in the audience. Being in the audience is such a fun experience. Good night.